Hello, English literature students. Here is one of the Rossetti poems for the exam. It's the first one chronologically and the first one on your anthology sheets. As you can see from the date and this first slide, Rossetti wrote this when she was only 18. I think it was written into something she wanted to publish the year later. Okay, so there's a really interesting context to how this poem was written, which also explains the fact this poem is quite a light poem. I think it's fair to say that. I don't think there's a lot of serious theme or content in this poem. It was produced during a family game, which the family played often. We've talked about how educated and cultured the family were and how much they admired poetry and writing. And the game they played, which was, they weren't the only people playing this game, it was popular. It was called Bout Rimé. I didn't put an accent on the rhyme bit. Literally means rhymed ends. We had a go at this, if you remember. So every person playing the game would be given enough rhyming words to then write a sonnet with. And then there was a time limit or a time competition to see who could write a sonnet using those end rhyme words quickest and also, best. And Christina Rossetti was excellent at this game, and there's some evidence that she could compose a sonnet with the rhymed ends in under 9 minutes. So this poem is the result of one of those competitions. She obviously thought it was a good one because she saved it and she put it into a later work, but not as a standalone poem. Okay, let's have a look at it. So it is a lively and light-hearted poem. So, I don't think anyone should take this too seriously, the criticisms or how it ends. You could certainly say it demonstrates Christina Rossetti's wit, okay, that she's being funny in a clever way, and a sharp eye for human weaknesses. She mocks the fashions being worn by both men and women of her class and of her place in London. But she does save her final joke for the butt of that joke are women who don't dress their age. Okay, now that's a lifelong butt for jokes, isn't it? So here are some images of the sorts of fashions that were around when Christina Rossetti was a young woman. These won't surprise you if you've seen any films set in the Victorian period. The women in large hooped skirts. The lady with her shoulders bare, that would be an evening dress. You wouldn't walk around in the day with your shoulders bare. And the men, although they're in dark colours, they've still got some quite fancy pants and fancy hats and fancy waistcoats. So there was, it's not like men didn't have fashion too. There's an image of muslin, in case, you weren't sure what it was or what a full and white muslin dress might look like. So that's a really nice image of a full white muslin dress. Muslin is a light cotton fabric. White was appropriate for young women. Nowadays, we associate white very much with brides, but in the 19th century, a young woman who wasn't yet married would wear white a lot of the time, balls and parties and things like that. There's also a joke in the poem about a woman who's too tall. And the ideal in Victorian times would have been, as today actually, for the man to be taller than the woman. And men were not expected to be too fancy. So these are two gendered ideas, aren't they? Women shouldn't be too tall, men shouldn't care too much about fashion. So a man with tassels on his back, she may well be mocking a young man for dressing too fashionably. The woman who's wearing the great coat towers above her sex with horrid height. So it's a bad thing that she's taller than other women. We also get descriptions of carriages. These were another sign of wealth and fashion in Victorian London. Only wealthy people could afford to keep a carriage because to have a carriage you also needed horses, and that's an expense all year round to look after the horses. You have to employ servants to look after the horses, and quite often servants to drive the carriage. I mean, young men may drive their own carriage. It was a very fashionable pastime in London to drive through the public parks in your fancy carriage. So we get some patronise a dog cart, some a hack, some think a painted Clarence only right. So those are the three carriages mentioned in the poem. The image there is a dog cart, that's the smallest and the lightest of the carriages mentioned. A hackney carriage was one that you could hire. Still today, some taxis you'll see have a hackney carriage licence, and a Clarence was a closed carriage. So just like people like different types of cars today, people would have different types of carriages in Victorian London. So this poem is about leisure activities that the upper middle classes could indulge in if they lived in London and had leisure time. And Christina Rossetti actually commented on the reference in the poem at the end where she suggests that you go and poke one of these women into the basin. She just uses the word basin. Certain old ladies dressed in girlish pink go to the basin, poke them o'er the rim. And Rossetti wrote, everyone will understand the basin to mean the one in St James's Park. So St James's Park was one of London's royal parks, still is today, and had been open to the public since the 1700s. And the basin means a large pond. So there's a large pond in the park, and you would get fashionable ladies and gentlemen walking there or driving their carriages, and that's the scene we get. For leisured classes, that's people who don't have to work and earn money, walking or riding in the park was a respectable and enjoyable activity. It was one of those things where you go to see and be seen. There were landscape gardens, paths, monuments and wildlife. And I hope you can see the image there. You've got a picture of people walking in the park. I think that is St James's Park. It is. This is a sonnet. Now, the octet I have broken down into two quatrains, but together those two quatrains make the quartet. But they do sort of stand out because all the lines in the first quatrain start with the same word. Some ladies like this, some gentlemen like this, some do this, some do that, some do the other. So that word some emphasises social diversity. Although I've said we're talking about, this small class, nevertheless, within that, there are all sorts of people. The social criticism becomes more overt in the second quatrain, where she starts to talk about bad fashions and tall women. The sestet, that's after the volta, and the volta is that if all the world were water, and this then also uses you, so the reader is then included in what we can call a satirical attack on these fashionable types of people. There are some who you would not teach to swim, rather preferring to see them drown. It's quite funny. Two imperatives for the comically shocking climax. Go to the basin, poke them o'er the rim. This is what's going to happen to these old ladies dressed in girlish pink. So if we look at the diction, we can see the contrast between the genders, which is really strongly policed and emphasised in Victorian culture and Victorian society, particularly the middle classes and above. That's brought out by certain antonyms, full versus succinct. So the women are dressing in these full dresses, whereas the men are dressed in succinct styles, which I hope the images showed you. Also, white is associated with the young women, where the men tend to wear black. Also the contrast between youth and age. So the old ladies are dressed in girlish pink, and that's their crime. They shouldn't do that. Some patronise a dog cart. Patronise doesn't at this point have all the strong negative connotations it has today of really being sort of looking down on someone and treating them like they're an idiot. It kind of just meant use something. So I would patronise a shop by going to a shop, but it does have some connotations of condescension by this point. There's also concern for social judgment in the phrase only right. Some think a painted Clarence only right. So what fashion is about is saying, I know what's in, I know what's correct. That description of the woman in her greatcoat, she's got two adjectives. She's described as towering and horrid. So that's really terrible to be a tall woman. You can see there. So I don't want to go too heavy on the themes, given that I'm trying to tell you this is quite a light-hearted poem. It mocks genteel society for how it dresses and acts, and I guess for how it cares how other people dress and act. It does mock women more than men, particularly both not meeting the appropriate ideas for their gender, but women get a bit more in the neck in this poem. The final violent image of pushing this poor old lady into the basin for the crime of wearing pink and flowers on her gown could suggest the repressed anger of young women, very much controlled by these Victorian codes of gendered behaviour, which tended to be imposed on younger women by older women. So it would be older women who would chaperone at parties and balls. It would be older women who would pass judgment and gossip, I guess. And I just wanted to say, it is interesting to see Christina Rossetti's comic side. A lot of the poems we study are quite dark and gloomy. So it's nice to see one where she's having a bit of fun, even if it is a bit harsh, it might seem.